Namaskar, welcome to this session. We have taken up consideration of very interesting topic called Vitarka Badha and Bhavana. Vitarka Badha. The more nobler the things, more virtuous the things, the more obstacles come in the ways. And the ignoble things do not have obstacles. They sail freely. They sail through freely. So, Yamas and Niyamas, which we were considering, are all noble practices. Obviously, the obstacles, impediments, antagonizers are plethora. So, that is the Vitarka Badha. That means when we are embracing noble practices, the opponents come in a big way and we have to encounter them. So that is called Vitarka, and which come in a very strong way for noble principles such as Yamas and Niyamas, Ahimsa Adi and Shaucha Adi. The Yamas and Niyamas have what is called as infections of opposites. Very strong infections, and we are all prone to be getting infected by himsa, asatya, steya, brahmacharya, parigraha, ashaucha, asantosha, tapabhav, anadhyay, aswadhyay, anishwar pranidhana or ishwara apranidhana. So what we encounter are fevers, and they are quite strong infections. So it is important to consider these vitarkas. But Patanjali scores over. He mentions the remedials. He mentions the measures to counter these. He mentions measures to prevent. He mentions the measures to counter them. And that is called Pratiksha Bhavana. So when we have infections, we go for antibiotics. And therefore, we don't fall prey to infections. We are saved from infections or effects of infections. So Pratipaksha Bhavana is something like that. Literally it means Pratipaksha, means opponents to these antagonizers. And there has to be Bhavana. We have to give rise to forces which will help us protect, which will help us be protected, get protected from the attack of fevers by way of himsa, asatya, steya, brahmacharya, parigraha, etc. So Patanjali scores over any other normative philosophers. They perhaps just caution us. Or many times they don't even caution, because usually we get instructions, practice the do's and avoid the don'ts. These are the do's and those are the don'ts. So we are only advised with regards to normative principles. But Patanjali makes us aware that when you are trying to imbibe, inculcate, develop these noble qualities, you will be facing what just now I refer to as infections. So it doesn't just suggest about do's and don'ts, but he warns us about them and also gives an investigative plan to really understand what is the extent of infection, what is the mode of infection, what is the extent of infection, and therefore we can really take some steps. Now, why is it that we have these infections? It is simply because our natural tendencies and propensities and all the vibrations around us are such that they give a lot of scope for Vitarka Badha. Another thing that has to be taken note of is that Patanjali is not just advising practicing Ahimsa, Satya, Steya, Brahmacharya, Aparigraha, Shaucha, Santosha, Tapaswadhyaya, Ishwar, which all those normative philosophers, normative scientists go on telling us, hammering us with those principles. But Patanjali expects that these should be adhered to on the plane of vows. That is vrata. The vrata should be either anuvrata, or when we are well qualified, it can be mahavrata. So it is not just considering the antagonizers of ahimsa vritti, satya vritti, asteya vritti, brahmacharya vritti, aparigraha vritti, so also about the niyamas. But basically, the vratas, one is expected to be in a vrata at some stage in life. It won't commence right away, but at some stage, these must get the priority in our life and should be able to take the grade of what is called as vrata vaikalya, vrata, vow. And when one is in vow, the vexation is greater. When we are in our normal walk of life and business activity of life, and then we are forced to or induced to, or we fall prey to opposites such as himsa, asatya, steya, brahmacharya, etc. It doesn't prick our consciousness. And therefore the reformation becomes that much difficult. So basically, reformation is possible only when one is practicing those conscientiously. There must be conscience to practice all these principles. And we commoners don't have it. So we don't feel so bad about not able to be adhering to ahimsa in some situation, condition, etc. If they are violated, they don't bother us. If the noble principles get violated, we don't bother much about it. So this is the reason when we don't bother much about it, the scope and chance to reform is that much meager, that much limited. But here, Patanjali is advising one to be in vows. So it should be understood that this is quite an hierarchy well above our hierarchies, because we don't bother so much. It doesn't prick our conscience. It doesn't prick our consciousness and conscience when there is violation of these vratas. Because we are not in vratas, we just try to practice. Maybe we'll sincerely try to practice Ahimsa, asatya, steya, brahmacharya, ashaucha, asantosha, tapasvadhyaya, shabdana. So we have quite a casual approach. And because it is casual approach, it doesn't hurt us in case if we have derailed from the track of these noble principles. So it should be noted that a minimum requirement is that one should be hurt in case these practices are not in place, or if one slips from these practices. There is hardly any chance for one's reformation if this doesn't happen. But when one is in vrata, maybe anuvrata, very atomic vow, one is not prone to compromise easily. One tries to frantically fight out, tries to stay in that vrata, even if it is anuvrata, with those what are delimiting factors for vrata, the vow. One tries to fight it out. This nature to fight it out, these fevers is important. So one earnestly feels that one should be in these principles, one should not compromise with these principles, one should not get derailed from these principles. And this happens only when something is taken up as a vow. So one doesn't easily give up the vow, or one doesn't easily compromise with the vow. So that is an important characteristic that one must be developing when one is in practice of noble principles. Just practicing noble principles is no doubt good, but we expect ourselves to be reformed by that. So that is utopian to be thinking that way. So when we take up something as a vow, we have bhavana behind it. We have fervor behind practicing those vows. So we practice those with vows. It is expected that we practice Yama Niyamas with some bhavana, with some fervor. And therefore, when we meet the antagonizers, there must be Pratiksha Bhavana, opposite kind of fervor. This is the literal meaning, flat, plain, literal meaning. So Patanjali's scheme of reformation is not meant for those who are papa pravana, prone to sinning, used to sinning, prone to sinning, dharma bhrashta. dharma landa, vyabhichari, durachari, pashavi. So a person who is a brute, wild brute, or a profane, there is no chance of reformation for such a person. That is not being mentioned here. So basically we must not be prone to himsa, asatya, steya, etc. So that is why these predicates were mentioned. Papa pravana dharma bhrashta dharma landa vyabhichari durachari pashavi. So we will have to take note of the background with which the sutra has been mentioned. And our practices of yoga, whether on the plane of moral ethical practices or other practices, physical practices, mental practices, there will be always the Pratiksha or the Vitarka Badha rather. There will be Vitarka Badha. See, these days, in our times, how does the yoga commence? Somebody enrolls in an institute, enrolls oneself in a class where yoga is taught. And then what form of yoga is taught today? Some 8-10 asanas and some Surya Namaskar, some pranayam, some pranava, some kriyas, and that gets the crown as if that is yoga. This is how we commence. But it doesn't commence with the way classically yoga would be commencing or used to commence. Basically, one needs to be in satvik ahar, vihar, achar, vichar. Until that time, even if you have commenced your yoga by way of attending a class, going to a teacher, it doesn't really start. So one must be gravitating towards satvik ahar, vihar, achar, vichar. Until that time, it is all pseudo yoga, which is available in plethora today. So as we have been repeatedly told that there is some kind of prelude to essential yoga and classical yoga by way of influence of the principles of yajna, dana, tapa, satsanga, sadhana sangha, shastra sangha, satvik ahar, vihar, achar, vichar. It is then that real yoga commences. Until that time, Yama Niyamas are only normative principles. Better to be practicing, that's all. Better if one is practicing, that's all. So basically, we don't need to resolve to be starting yoga today. It is just register oneself in an institution where yoga is imparted or a class where yoga is taught. We have to do those formalities and get registered and then commence our pursuit. Whereas it is proper that if we have dharmya pravrutti, dharmya vritti, dharmya achar, dharmya vichar. So we will have to wait for all these things to come up, and they come up by all those preludes mentioned to yoga by way of yajna, dan, tapas, sangatraya, ahar, vihar, achar, vichar, chatushyam, which has been repeatedly brought to your notice. So when one is that way earnestly into yoga, then if there are violations of practices, then there is a self-remorse, prick of consciousness, prick of conscience. So that's the bare minimum requirement to come to this topic of Vitarka Badha and Pratiksha Bhavana. In simple words, the yoga dharma must have dawn in consciousness. Then when we take up these principles with that dharma having a dawn, and when there is a violation, that's a totally different condition. And that is what is to be understood here as a prelude to this topic. Now, one might think that Pratiksha, that the Vitarka Badha doesn't occur to one who is well established in yoga. But this is not true. Again, we must be familiar with the reality. This Vitarka Badha can come to anyone and everyone. It is not only that someone like you and me counter these things. Vitarka Badha can happen to anyone, everyone, even on a very high hierarchy of yoga. And it is better to understand at least how it might be for someone who is on high hierarchy and attacked by Vitarka Badha. The point is, usually it is said that one fumbles when very raw and rudimentary. But the fact of the matter is that the anadi karma vasana, papa vasana, they are so strong that even a yogi, practitioner of yoga on a very high hierarchy, perhaps a yogi for us, also counters these Pratiksha. I recall Santa Shiromani, the greatest of great saints, Sri Tukaram Maharaj, admits very candidly, Ratran Divas Ama Yuddhata Prasanga. He says, day and night we are in a battle. So it should not be deemed that way that it is only those who are rudimentary or raw practitioners of yoga would be countering these Pratiksha Badha. It would be too naive to consider that way. As a matter of fact, the more and more you scale up in Paramartha, the problems are greater. Because in neo-spiritualism, we are given to believe that spiritual path is a goody-goody path. Because we are in an era where spirituality is propagated. It is in propagation. And therefore the masters give us an impression that once you are in the spiritual path, your problems are mitigated. And this is what they almost promise us. Be in Adhyatma, it will be a goody-goody path. It will be a path of roses. But that is not true. Absolutely not true. It is indeed the condition, like Tukaram Maharaj has said, that day and night we have a battle to face. That is why in Adhyatma, classically we are often told that one needs to be a Dhira Purusha. You need superhuman courage to be in a path of spirituality. But today's Adhyatma gives us the opposite picture, that you don't need all that. You don't need to be such a courageous person to adhere to Adhyatma, because we are shown something as Adhyatma or spiritualism as Paramartha, which is quite enticing and alluring. That's a Maya by itself. The point is, the more you are on a higher rung of yoga, you will have to counter these Vitarka Badha of higher magnitude. So the battle in life for one on the spiritual path really doesn't end. The battle becomes more and more fierce. So the reality must be cited here, and not to be under the impression of a misconception that Adhyatma is a path of rose. Upanishads will never give you such a view which we get in Adhyatma in our times. So Upanishads indeed endorse the condition that Tukaram Maharaj expressed, that day and night we are in battle. Patanjali himself will be telling us that yogis on higher rung, they are yogis, understand. And there are various rungs of yogi called Madhu Pratika, Madhubhumi plane of yogi. Even after accomplishing samadhi, the problems don't end. The problems have greater jaws opened to swallow. So Patanjali in one place says that such yogis get allurement from celestial planes. The celestial beings will allure such a yogi and wean such a yogi away from the practices. So they give enticement, they show enticement, they present enticements. They present the enticement of giving that yogi a celestial hood and deprive him from that, those practices that he has embraced. The point is that accomplished yogis also get allurements. So in a sutra of Vibhuti Pada 51 Sutra 3.51, it is such a precarious condition that yogi will be having. If he doesn't pray, doesn't fall prey to allurements, and is quite resolved with respect to be firmly rooted in practices, yogic practices, and resolves and just rejects their invitations, still there is a problem on the other hand. It is called smaya. Yogi will develop ego, pride, arrogance, that I refused the allurements which came from celestial beings. So there is problem on either sides. If you fall a prey, there is a problem. If you don't fall a prey, there is a problem. So yogis have a greater predicament when they have to counter Pratiksha, they Vitarka Badha. They will have to be more tactful and skillful in rising up Pratiksha Bhavana. So, in that Sutra 3.51, Vyasa tells us about the predicament of a yogi when he counters the Vitarka Badha. So he says, when this yogi is in that Brahma Vritti, very fully bloomed and blossomed Brahma Vritti, when he gets allurements, enticements, then he will be agitated within the chitta. And he can react in different ways. So one of the reactions that he mentions in his commentary there, he says that he becomes immediately perverted. There is perversion in him. He says, one who is going against me, I will slay this person. I will kill this person, I will banish this person. So in what way Ahimsa has been now put into jeopardy? Or I will blatantly speak the untruth. I will grab that person of his wealth. I will grab that person of his the woman of that person even. So this is what happens. Our infections are not so strong, but the infections can be very strong. Like if an infant has to be gripped by infection, little infection is enough. But a grown-up person, the infection, to really become infection, needs to attack very strongly. The infection must be strong, then only one is infected. But if a person is weak, infection can be very weak and the person can fall prey to infections. And therefore, the Vitarka Badha that is spoken about is not just obstacles that we might counter in our life while we are practicing yoga, but he is advising these people who are already in the plane of yoga, who are already quite a way gone ahead in path of yoga. For them he has advised, and we have to find our advice in what he has said to them. Patanjali is not directing advices to you and me. We don't need advice at all because it doesn't work. Because we are all vulnerable to Vitarka Badha. And even when you get those infections, we are not really harassed and tormented. But one who is in practice of yoga, when the infections attack him, his reactions are different. And with that regard, he has said, Krodha Mulaka, Lobha Mulaka, Moha Mulaka, or Lobha Purvaka, Krodha Purvaka, Lobha Krodha Moha Purvaka. So we have to understand how Lobha, Krodha, Moha work for us. And in case a yogi is getting Lobha, Krodha, Moha, how devastating it would be. So Patanjali is actually mentioning all this with regards to such a person, and we have to deduce advice to us from what he has said. When you and me get infuriated, not huge devastation takes place. But someone like Durvasa gets infuriated, we know what kind of devastation would be there in store. So tapasvi, great tapasvi. With regards to them, we have to understand, because actually what is explicit is advice to them, and then what is implicit is advice to us. So how this Vitarka Badha takes place, it is advisable for one to look into life of a great rishi called Vishwamitra. Vishwamitra's life was a roller coaster ride. And ultimately he reached the pinnacle point called Brahma Vritti. He became Brahmarshi. So rishis are to be found on various planes, such as rishis, rajarshis, maharshis and brahmarshis. So Vishwamitra had a journey of his lifetime commencing from the lowest rung, and therefore it is advisable to look into life of Vishwamitra and how he countered various badhas by way of lobha, krodha, moha. So Vishwamitra, who was just a Gadhiraja, became Brahmarshi in lifetime, and therefore it is advisable that one looks into life of Brahmarshi Vishwamitra. So it will be quite possible that we think that advices are coming to us here. But we should also always have a broader view, not as to what obstacles will come to us today, now, here, in our level, but also we must be prepared in understanding as to how obstacles would come in higher levels of our practices. Anyway, there are Yama Vitarkas and Niyama Vitarkas. So let's try to understand how in the text Vyasa tells us about Yama Vitarka, which is just a sample on the basis of what he mentions. We have to infer and deduce Shauchadi Vitarka as well, Niyama Vitarkas as well. So this is a kind of heedlessness on account of which our yoga fades out in certain scenarios, situations, conditions. Some other priorities score over us, material priority scores over us, and that's how we become callous about our practices. We become neglectful about our noble practices. We tend to take recourse to postponements to our practices, suspension to our practices for a while. So that doesn't really create a problem to us. Now it should create a problem that if your yoga is taking a back seat because of priorities in your life, that should be a matter of concern basically. If that is not a matter of concern and we have justification for deviating for our yoga, then we are not potentials for reformations. So let's try to understand the Vitarka Badha that comes in Vyasa's commentaries, his expression. But let's take it next time. Enough for the time being. Namaskar all.